This is going to work eventually. All right, look at that. All right, so we are live. Right, as you guys jump in, I'm going to go straight into the lecture. 1 second. Okay, so we are coming in live. Some people jumping in. We are finishing We the People chapter 12. So I'll give the people on the live stream a second to bring up those slides, right? We're going to do the last few slides of We the People chapter 12, and then we're going to go into We the People chapter 13, right? And those files are on the web campus, so go ahead and look those up before you get going. I've been looking, so not a lot of people are in the class, not a lot of people live streaming, but a lot of you are watching the video. So I'm still getting about 30 to 35 people every class section who are at least watching it, right? We do have an exam coming up, right? And this is the third exam. So, right, once you have 3 exams in, we can discuss what your grades are going to look like. I have another reporting where I have to tell people whether or not they're actually contributing to this course. I don't feel it's appropriate to do sort of attendance because of the situation that we're in. But if you are missing too much work, I'm going to report that you're not in the class. That's the way I'm going to report it, right? Because you can do the work. Now, the other part is that if there's missing any assignments, if there's anything that you're not doing, right after exam 3, email me and explain, right? I had a student, every semester I have a student who gets a bad car accident, whether that's true or not, or whether they produce documentation. Usually every semester I have a student who has dealing with some sort of issue, right? And it's usually a medical issue, like a serious medical issue. And this semester, especially, right, you have a lot of reason to say, look, I'm dealing with something, or, right, if you, right, aren't feeling great, there's free testing. If you test positive, don't come in, but also talk to me because I know it's going to take time away from you, right? So come talk to me before the exam if you need help. And then after exam, when I give a report, we can talk about how we're going to try and get you to a passing grade. But we're reaching this deadline, right? The exam is next week, the election's next week, and then the week after that, the paper's due. We're hitting this crunch time, and if you're not on top of it, you need to be on top of it for the next couple of weeks. Get everything together. I have gotten some email submissions for extra credit for voting, right? Every time I get the extra credit for voting, it seems fine. You guys give me very different. Some people have I voted stickers, some people have like their sample ballot. That's all fine, right? It's honor system. I trust you. Just show me something that you engaged politically, right? And I like the idea of voting. If you voted early, that's fine. If you're voting on election day, that's fine. Just give me some evidence of that. Do not take pictures of other people. Don't send me any selfies. Selfies are always problematic, right? Because you don't check your backgrounds to see if there's someone else, right? Did you get permission from that individual to take that picture, right? So just take a picture of the paper or the sticker, right? Don't give me any personal information. Don't give any personal information away. Be careful with that. The other part is that the paper submission should be live right now. So if there's a problem with that, but if you need to submit the paper, I will respond to the emails and say, I just wanted to get a very clear answer. Submit the paper, right? Make sure you have the in-text citation. Make sure you reference all 3 articles. If you haven't started the paper, it's due in about 2 weeks. Make sure that you're on top of that. I don't allow late paper submissions because it takes me a while to grade your papers, right? It takes me about half an hour to grade each paper, and there are 44 students. So we're talking about 22 hours to grade the papers themselves. So I have to set a block aside, which means that I can't accept late papers, right? There's just no way that I can do that at the end of the semester with all the other stuff that's going to be going on. So make sure you look at it, make sure you read the paper prompt, make sure you follow the paper prompt and how I grade, because I'm very specific about the grade that you're going to get based on the work that you do, right? Now, I don't need it to be exceptionally long, right? Be very concise. Just make sure that you're talking about the arguments and the articles and avoid normative language and you'll be fine. Otherwise, everything else is fine. Just make sure you're talking about the articles empirically, make sure you discuss them in a way that's scientific and avoid anything normative, right? If you think, oh, it's wrong because it's wrong morally, great, that's your opinion. That's not important. That's not what I'm trying to grade you on. Remember, I don't care whether or not you're for or against it. I care about your interpretation of the arguments and how they react to the supremacy clause where the federal government decides what is legal and the 10th Amendment, which protects states' rights, right? That's the issue, right? Marijuana is not the issue. The issue is federal government law versus, right, international law versus state law. That's what I want you to talk about. Why is it okay? Why is it not okay? Is it better for those states to have it and not other states to have it, right? Why did Colorado and Nevada and California get economic buffs? Because the states around them don't allow it. So people do come here. But we have laws against people going to places to break the law. So is that problematic, right? Each argument is valid, whether you're for or against. That's not the point. The point is that you produce enough material that I can say you thought about this critically, you wrote a paper, and I can say that moving into your next course, your next semester and your next courses, that you're more prepared for other things, not just this issue, not just political science, but paper writing, critical thought. And that's really why you have to take this class, is to learn about American government and Nevada government, but also to encourage you to understand government critically. All right. So let's go to chapter 12. We were on the last two slides. I apologize. One of the things that I'm realizing is that as the weather has started to change, that if you can't hear it, it's very hard on my voice to sort of shout at you the whole time. If you're in the live stream, you can't tell, but I'm sure the people in the classroom are basically yelling at you for an hour and a half. And between that and other factors, right, that it's just taking out my voice. And so sometimes we will end class early. I think we did last time, a few minutes early, but mostly because I want to be sure I'm clear and I can tell that I'm starting to trail off in my voice, and that's not fair to you, right? So if we get to a point where we need some supplementals, I will post some supplementals on my own time, right, just to make sure that we're on the same page. But for the most part, I think we're doing pretty good. We're back on track. And then the last part of the course is really going to be about getting people to where they want to be, right? If you have a B and you're trying to get an A, how do I get you to study and learn how to pick up terms in an appropriate way to get you to an A? If you're really struggling and you're just trying to get through the semester, which I understand, right? Semesters can be very difficult, especially semesters like this, right? Then we'll talk about that. All right, so we're going to go to the slide that starts with oversight. I believe that's where we left off. Right, so Congress has a role. Congress has this role where they want to check on everything. And this is part of Congress's job, is why do we have congressional hearings? Why do we have a hearing on the Supreme Court justice when it's the president who nominates, right? All of the reasons this occurs is because Congress has an oversight role. And there are two different types of oversight. There's what's called fire alarm oversight, right? Fire alarm oversight is where you just wait for something to happen or someone to bring it to your attention, right? Congress has the benefit that voters will tell them when something's wrong, right? Whenever the voters care about something, they'll contact their elected official. They will. I mean, it seems that we don't see this as much in our daily lives, but there is an entire process that elected officials have for processing mail from constituents. Right? They always go through, they say, okay, how do we process this mail? What are the issues of our constituents? We talked about that a big part of an elected official's job is recognizing, right, the issues of the constituents. That's called fire alarm. You don't look for a problem, you let other people tell you when there is a problem and you respond to those problems. And so oversight can happen that way. The other side is police patrol oversight. And we call it a police patrol because you actively go out and you look for problems. Now, some congressional oversight does occur as police patrol, but it's much more rare. Why? Because it's expensive, right? Why do we have, right, a fire alarm system everywhere and police patrols? Because they're very different, right? Oversight is very different when you're comparing those two models, right? Now, police patrol is very difficult for a congressperson because they can't patrol every district. They can't go through their constituency all the time. That takes too much resources, right? So when we see oversight, it's going to be called fire alarm oversight. And that's where you let someone else tell you the problem. That's where you let the constituents generally, but also other times, right, someone else tells you the problem. In the 70s, right, there was this idea that lead was safe in gasoline, right? You used to have leaded and unleaded gasoline, right? Well, eventually this individual comes to Congress and he says, right, it is causing brain damage to our young people, right? That lead in our air is very, very problematic, right? That individual came and said, here's a problem, and then Congress, as a fire alarm oversight, right, responded to that, right? Police patrol, there's not really good examples. Congress doesn't really do that type of oversight. When they do that oversight, it's typically through hearings. Hearings help bring attention to the public. We talked about in the media section about going public, but also just through hearings to gain information, right? The tech companies are back in front of Congress again through Senate, through hearings. right? And they're going to be asked a lot of tough questions. And the point is for Congress to figure out what can be done. What are the options, right? We know that many of these tech companies have more influence over speech than other aspects of our lives, right? And so engaging in that can be very difficult. The next thing is appropriations, right? Appropriations just means the amount of money spent on any individual aspect, right? And an appropriation is how much money you're allowed to spend. So I say, here is your appropriations for that. This is how much money I'm giving you. It's different from a budget, right? The agencies set a budget, right? They say, this is how much we need. This is how much our budget should be for our organization, right? The Army sets its own budget, right? The FDA, right? All of these agencies, the CIA, the FBI, they all set their budget. But what happens is they set a budget, and then Congress decides whether or not they get all of that money, whether they get some of that money, or whether or not they get, right, certain aspects of it. And so appropriations is Congress controlling how much money goes to everything. And so appropriations is a very powerful way for Congress to dictate behavior, right? If they don't want certain behaviors, right, they're not going to fund things. In the early 2000s, right, a largely Democratic Congress did not want to fund the Iraq War. And so they said, we're not going to pay for certain things like up-armored vehicles, right? Obviously that backfired because then it makes it look like they're willing to put soldiers' lives at risk, right? So they fail, they end up funding that. In other cases, right, the president wants certain things, the government says, no, we're not going to pay for it. We talked about this idea of a border wall, right? It's largely unfinished, right? Because it's not the president who decides the money that goes to it. And so the Congress decides appropriations, they decide how much money goes to that project. And so by not funding that, in effect makes it not happen. And this is true for all cases, right? If you don't want a policy in Congress and the president wants some enforcement, however the enforcement is, right? If you just underfund that aspect, then it won't get done, right? You need funds to accomplish things in the United States, in the United States government. When Congress will not work with the president can avoid the legal statute through what's called an executive agreement. And an executive agreement is a process where the president and another executive from another country agree to some behavior. Now, executive agreements are very beneficial, right, because they allow the president to act individually, right, as one branch and engaging with other states, right? It's good for diplomacy. However, right, it does require the Senate get involved, right? So it acts like a treaty, but it doesn't require the Senate to get involved, right? Typically, whenever you have a treaty, the Senate has to consent on that treaty, right? And we'll talk about that later, how treaties are treated. Treaties in the United States act as law, right? If we accept and ratify a treaty, we treat that as domestic law. So for us, treaties are behaved a little differently because the Senate may not want to accept a treaty and then have that law apply to the United States, right? If you're reading the articles in the next couple of weeks, one of the things is the United States pursues a drug control regime where they try to pressure other countries to ban marijuana use, right? But we never actually ratified that treaty because it would make it illegal in the United States, right? So sometimes you don't want to accept a treaty because it makes it law in the United States. And in other places, in other countries, that's not as true. When you need to avoid that, when you can't get congressional consent, right, you have an executive agreement. An executive agreement is very expedient, but as we saw at every administration, right, was as Bush leaves and Obama comes in, Obama removes executive agreements that existed under Bush. When Trump comes in, he removes executive agreements that Obama set in place, right? And these executive orders, right? That is the weakness of it, is that every time you get a new president, many of those executive orders and executive agreements will be removed. And the last part, Congress has the power to impeach. And we have seen this a couple of times, and impeachment can be, right, a crime, but it has to be something that negatively impacts the United States. There has to be a crime in which the negatives in the United States are negatively impacted. Now, the other part that became very true, right, is the House of Representatives doesn't actually have to submit evidence. It's not an evidence-based, it's not a court-based system, right? There doesn't have to be the evidence of wrongdoing. There has to be the suggestion of wrongdoing because people vote based on their partisan allegiances. Why is it that we knew, right, Trump was going to be impeached in the House, but it wouldn't lead anywhere in the Senate? right? The House has to vote first, and then it goes to a Senate hearing. We knew that it was going to pass the House, that impeachment was going to pass through the House because it was a Democrat-controlled House. We knew it was going to fail in the Senate because it was a Republican-controlled Senate, right? They were very clear about this, right? One of the things that has been very true about Mitch McConnell is as much as whether you like him or not, he's very clear about this. He said, we're not going to claim to be impartial. No one's mind's going to be changed by this hearing. We already know the outcome, right? They knew that all the Republicans were going to be in support of their president, right? Whether they agree with the president or not doesn't matter. They're not going to vote to impeach a president of their own party. That's not going to happen. So because of that, right, impeachment is a very complicated process. Very rarely has something happened where impeachment has actually led to removal, right? We know that Nixon, right? Nixon clearly violated the rules of politics, right? He also violated the law, right? There's a lot of obstruction of justice, but he also recorded himself doing these things, right? That's very rare to have a recording of yourself committing a crime, right? The behavior of Nixon is a little unique, right? And even then, right, he resigned and was pardoned, right? And before that, right, was a significant amount of time ago. So impeachments are very rare, and they require either an exceptional crime by the president or, right, the right alignment of political parties, right? If Democrats had controlled the Senate in this last impeachment, then the president would have been impeached, right? All right, so as a review, right, remember Congress is a committee system, right? Every law that you want to make starts as a bill in committee. It goes to committee, it gets marked up, and then the chair of that committee can kill that before it ever gets out of that committee. The next part is once it does get to out of committee, then in the House of Representatives, right, there's something called the House Rules Committee, and they decide whether or not it's an open or closed debate, how much time is for debate, and whether or not amendments will be allowed. And therefore, by being in control of a specific committee, like the Armed Services, or Veterans Affairs, or Agriculture, you can control which issues go through that committee, right? So that matters, right? And then the Rules Committee has value, and then of course the House Ways and Means Committee, because they decide appropriations. They decide how much money goes to things. And so great, if you want a new environmental bill, but the House Ways and Means Committee won't give you any money for it, right, then it's dead. So there's a lot of places in the House of Representatives where bills can die. And because of that, it gives parties a lot of control, right? If I'm the majority leader in the Senate, right, why does Mitch McConnell play such an important role? He decides who goes on what committees. And therefore, one, I decide whether or not you have a say in certain issues, right? That's committee control. But two, you have to sort of keep in line with the party, right? The Republican Party has to stay in line with the Mitch McConnell platform and the president's platform because they control what committee assignments occur, right? Committee assignments. The same is true for Nancy Pelosi and the Speaker of the House. You can't be too far away from the Democratic Party because then you won't get a seat on the committees that you want to be on to influence the issues that you want to influence, right? The Environmental Services Committee used to not be a big seat, and now it's a bigger and bigger seat. But if you want that seat and you're a Democrat, you have to make sure that you're close enough to the platform of the Democratic Party and Nancy Pelosi to get that seat. That gives them a lot of power. The other part is there's a lot of funding that goes through the party, the Democratic or the Republican Party, and they decide how to distribute those funds. If you're not aligning with the party, then you're not going to get those funds, right? And we know that to win a campaign, you need a lot of money. Okay. We talked about the Congress, the Electoral Correction, which is a book by David Mayhew, right? You have gerrymandering, which has caused very homogenous districts, right? Districts are either much more conservative or much more liberal than they were in the past. And therefore, if you want to get reelected, you have to align with your party, right? If you're a Republican, you need to be more conservative to get elected. If you're a Democrat, you need to be more liberal to get elected. An election is very important to those individuals, right? Political parties are seeking reelection. That's what they want, right? A political party wants to get in office. An interest group wants to change policy, right? So if you want to stay in office, you have to align with your district. And getting reelected when districts are becoming more homogenous means you need to be farther away from the center to hold your interests, right? As people become more partisan, the representatives become more partisan. The last part is, of course, we're going to have more stalemates in Congress. One, look at the way that bills are made, right? You should understand better why it takes so long. You have so many veto players, so many people that can kill a bill, right? That it can end that process. But also, right, if you're not going to be willing to work with a Republican, if you're a Democrat, and if you're Republican, you're not willing to work with a Democrat, then bipartisanship is dead, right? You can't be bipartisan because that'll cost you electorally. And so the more homogenous our districts become, the more problematic that becomes. And it might be a good thing because we want Congress to slowly act, right? The job of the Senate, right? The House gets to be crazy and responsive to the public. The Senate should be slower. It should be a slower process where we think things through. It's a reflective body, right? And so we want that filibuster, we want that cloture. So you have to include everyone in decision making, right? Because, right, we know that inclusive decision making leads to better governance, right? We have a lot of research on that material. Okay. That was the end of chapter 12. So when we go into chapter 13, let's talk about the presidency, right? Let's get into the presidency. Okay. So the President of the United States, right, is established through Article 2, right? One of the things about the American system, if you become a political science major, is that we have a presidential system. And presidential systems behave very differently than parliamentary systems. And when the US was founding its government, the Federalists, right, when we talk about going from the Articles of Confederation to the existing US Constitution, one of the things that the Federalists argued is that you need an energetic office. You need the energy of the president because the president needs to get things done, right? Congress is by design going to be slower. It has veto players, right? It has the Senate, which is a reflective body. You have a part that is slowing things down and sort of taking its time, right? You have the judicial branch, which doesn't actually introduce policy. It just judges, right, the court cases and the legitimacy and the constitutionality of those laws, right? So nothing is really there to get things going and moving, right? And so the president is expected to get things done. The president is elected through an electoral college, right? I would be very surprised if you hadn't heard about the electoral college, but also I think there's going to be a lot of discussion in the next week about the electoral college, right? And just voting. And so just, right, on election night, you're going to get a lot of this material. I suggest that you later in the evening or watch some election coverage or something, right? You're going to get a lot of information about what's happening. We're going to see some unique experiences about vote counts, right? An electoral college changes the landscape. You're not just trying to get the most votes, you have to get the most votes in certain states. And what we'll see is almost a guarantee that Joe Biden will get more total votes nationwide, right? There are more Democrats in the country than Republicans. So we should expect Biden to get the popular vote. The majority of the votes should go to Joe Biden. That does not mean he will be president because he has to win key states, right? Pennsylvania, right? Florida, Nevada, Arizona, right? These are battleground states. And so when you have battleground states, your electoral behavior is going to be different. The electoral college changes how the president gets elected. And then in the Constitution, right, there are three different types of powers: express powers, implied powers, and delegated powers. We've talked about these. The first is the express powers. We'll talk about this. The president has very specific powers that are given to that individual in that office, right? Remember, the executive branch, the leader of the executive branch is the president. We talked about implied powers earlier in the semester. This is that necessary and proper clause, right? Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that anything that is necessary and proper to fulfill the tasks that you've been given, right? Anything that is necessary and proper to make sure that you can fulfill your expressed powers, right? And then the last part is delegated powers. Now, delegated powers work in such a way that one branch gives power to the next branch. And what has happened is since the 1800s, right, all the way until about 1980s, 1990s, Congress has been giving its power to the president, right? The War Powers Act, right? All of these other behaviors. The president can send troops places without a declaration of war in order to act quickly, right? That's the energy of the president aspect. But, right, Congress has the power to declare war. So Congress has slowly but surely been giving its power to the president. Because in some ways, right, you need a quick reaction, but in other ways, it makes the president responsible for many of these issues, right? It limits accountability. So delegated powers are problematic because Congress could take them back with a new bill, but how many bills are we likely to see where they demand power from the president, right? That's highly unlikely. And so what we have today in the 21st century is an incredibly powerful executive branch that has more power than it initially had under the Constitution. All right, so one of the express powers given to the president is this idea of express powers is the military, right? The president is the commander in chief. One second. And one of the things about the United States that really has become sort of a democratic principle globally is you want civilian command of your military, right? That militaries themselves are led by generals, right? Generals run the military. But the military ultimately needs to respond to the civilian public. And so democracies worldwide have adopted this over time, that eventually the president is the commander of the military, right? Because civilians need to be in charge at some point, right? Why do you have a Secretary of Defense, right? Why do you have this chain of command above the generals? Because you want civilian control of the military. You also want the president, okay. You also want the president to be the head of the nation's intelligence network, right? Now, this is a little more difficult to understand, but you want to make sure that the intelligence work is being done to serve the nation, and the president is the only one with the mandate to serve the nation, right? Remember, the president gets elected nationally, the only office in which there is an expectation that they will represent the entire nation and everyone in it, and therefore intelligence networks need to respond to that to make sure that they're talking to someone who has that mandate, right? The president has a responsibility to look over the entire country, and then for intelligence agencies need to do that. We have seen in the past, one of the reasons why that's necessary is because intelligence is often done in this way of protecting strategic resources. So, right, an intelligence worker, I worked in the military intelligence when I was in the Army. One of the things is I'm always looking at ports and, right, major cities, and I'm always looking at things that we need to function, right? Whereas elected officials be like, well, what about those people in small towns? What about those people who live on the coast but don't necessarily have a major port by them? Those people matter as well, right? And it's a civilian's job, right, to enforce that. So the president has to say, we need to be inclusive of everyone when we're trying to protect and defend them, and therefore has to be head of the intelligence networks. They also aren't as informed, right? The CIA and other agencies don't inform president, but that's about what's called plausible deniability, right? That it is possible for these agencies to commit crimes at some point it is possible for these agencies to commit a crime and they don't want to inform the president they committed a crime, but it might be necessary for them to commit a crime to ensure the safety. So you have all these problems, right? He's the head of the agencies and the intelligence network, but also isn't always kept in the loop about every single aspect. The last part is there is a lot of domestic power, right? One of the things is that if I, as president, see an emergency, I can declare a state of emergency and I can go and give resources, right? Whether this is enforcing judicial order, where I say you have to live up to the system, or when it's an emergency, right? We see a lot of times when we have a hurricane, we had a natural disaster, a governor would say, I have a state of emergency, and then the president would come in and find resources and move resources towards that individual, right? When it came to civil rights, we have the example that we talked about earlier in the semester, when Governor Faubus, right, from Arkansas, did not want to allow desegregation of schools, and therefore the president nationalized, right, the National Guard, took that National Guard and made it part of the federal government to remove any issue, right, and force the behavior on the state. So that is one aspect of domestic power that lets the president declare a state of emergency and take power away from states in order to accomplish something when an emergency happens. Right? It also sets a precedent, right? The president can take over certain aspects and mandate certain things in states, which is another great conversation about states' rights versus the federal government. Right? So we talked about the military role. The next express power is the judicial role, right? Reprieves, pardons, and amnesty. So a reprieve is some sort of just forgiveness for something, right? That I'm not going to charge you. Sometimes we talk about commuting a sentence. A pardon is where the president argues that something is not, they're no longer convicted of a crime. One of the things about a pardon is it doesn't just take away your sentencing, right? A pardon doesn't say, oh, you were committed of a crime, you're not going to serve your jail time. That's commuting a sentence. That's a reprieve, right? A pardon says, we're going to treat it as if you were never prosecuted. We're just going to take that away, right? We're going to say that court case never happened. And so a pardon is very powerful because it gives its behavior. And the other part is amnesty. And amnesty is where you can sort of claim for larger groups, right, that they're not going to be prosecuted in this situation, right? I'm from California. One of the things that used to happen a lot was amnesty for people who were undocumented, right? You would just say, anyone who's been here, anyone who's here right now, who's not a citizen, we're going to reset the clock and you can go and file paperwork and say that you want to file for citizenship, and we're going to restart all of your deadlines, right? If you've been here too long, right? Amnesties for a larger population, pardons are for individuals. In 1974, right, Nixon, right, resigns. And the expectation is that Nixon's going to go to jail, right? He committed a crime. And so Ford pardons him. And this is part of a longer tradition of not prosecuting individuals who were used to be president. One of the things that's very strange is that Trump, if he is not in office after this election, may be facing criminal charges. And it's not clear if he's legally allowed to pardon himself, right? We used to think that, no, you can't pardon yourself, right? But it's not very clear that that's a power that exists, that you can't pardon yourself. And if that doesn't happen and there's criminal charges, right, we have had a long-standing tradition where we don't prosecute former presidents, right? Other countries do that. They prosecute the former presidents. And we believe as political scientists that that's damaging to your democracy. There's a lot of evidence that if he thinks he's going to jail afterwards, he'll fight harder to stay in office. Now, I don't know the outcome of the election. I don't have a stake in that, right? But the point is that we have a tradition of pardoning presidents as they leave to not worry about this. Jimmy Carter pardoned all the draft evaders of the Vietnam War. So in 77, after the Vietnam War had ended, there were a lot of people who were facing criminal charges, who had gotten their draft number, who were supposed to serve in the military, who did not, right? Who they were evading. They couldn't sign up for federal government jobs or resources, right? And so Carter wanted to move past that. So sometimes when we're talking about a pardon, it's not about this is wrong, this person shouldn't be prosecuted. Sometimes it's we want to move past this issue. I want to stop spending resources on trying to find draft dodgers and punishing them. That's not worth our time, so we're going to move forward, right? We've seen that before marijuana was legal in some states, it was decriminalized. Why? Or many of those individuals got a commuted sentence. Because why are we spending so much money imprisoning and arresting those individuals, right? Now, whether or not that's acceptable to you, that's not the point. The point is that pardons start to create this issue of, do I want to continue to deal with this, or do I want to eliminate that problem by saying I'm not going to treat those people as criminals, right? I'm not going to treat what they did as a crime anymore. We're just going to move past it. And when it comes to draft dodgers in the Vietnam War, right? After the Vietnam War, you don't even have a draft, right? The draft is sort of ending, and then you don't need a draft as we go to a professional military, right? So moving past that's very easy. The next aspect is diplomatic, where you are head of state, right? And we actually saw a really great aspect of this, right? Not great in what it was done, but a very clear example is when the president, right, recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, right? Now, the capital didn't move, right? Israel has a capital, Tel Aviv, and it's been there for a long time. And they still say that their capital was Tel Aviv, right? That's where all the buildings are. That's where the government infrastructure is. But by having the president recognize a state, right, or recognize aspects of a state, gives a lot of power in the international community, right? We've talked about this before. Presidents don't say Palestine, they say the occupied territory, because you don't want to, as president, say that Palestine is a state because that's recognition. And when you have that diplomatic recognition, one of the things that happens is it might create obligation. If you say Palestine is a state, and then you say, and then people argue, well, Israel's building settlements in that state, then you have to respond to that. But if you say it's occupied territory, then you don't have to respond to the behavior of other states around it. Now, I'm not trying to get into a debate about those things or any of that aspects, right? But the point is that presidents will not recognize Palestine as a state. They will say the occupied territory. And we have a president who recognized the capital as Jerusalem, right? Because it was important to his base, right, that Israelis have control over Jerusalem, right, for religious reasons mostly, right? But that recognition has diplomatic power because Israel doesn't have to move their capital, right? Just gives them recognition in the international community. The other part about the diplomatic aspect is this executive agreements. We were just talking about this, right? An executive agreement is just the president and another country, and it acts as a treaty, but usually it's just an agreement because remember the president has the enforcement mechanism, right? The president controls the military. So if you say we're not going to have an embargo around this part of your country, or we're going to have a free trade area in this part of your country, and that's an agreement, it's those military personnel and those agencies that are all agreeing to behave in a certain way, right? It's usually not as impactful on domestic issues, except when it comes to trade. Okay. Now, one of the things is in the executive branch is the executive aspect of the presidency, right? Of the executive branch, right? That seems a little redundant. Article 2, Section 3 gives the reason why the president is so involved in so many of these things. The president is expected to faithfully execute all the laws, right? Right? He appoints the executive officers, and so this part allows him to hire and fire whoever he wants, right? He can say you need to resign, right? To anyone. So for anyone working in the executive branch can be hired or fired. The thousands of people, right? The president decides, right, all of this, right? And you all are probably much for West Wing, right? But everyone used to say this thing, I serve at the pleasure of the president, right? Whenever the president doesn't want you, you are gone, right? That's just how it works, right? The other part of that is that the reason why the president decides who stays and who goes is because there's an expectation that every law will be executed by the president, right? The laws are executed by the executive branch, right? That's why it's called the executive branch. It executes the law, right? Congress makes the law, and then the executive enforces the law. Make sure it's applied to all people. Right now that we have the 14th Amendment, right? Everyone is applied the law in the same way. Now, because of the role of the president, right, and because it enforces the law, but it also deals with military and secrecy and intelligence networks, the president can at any time claim executive privilege. Anything between the president and an individual can be considered confidential because it's with the president. And, right, because executive privilege can be extended, even if you have a subpoena, even if someone tells you you have to speak under oath, right, you can always claim executive privilege. You can say, I am not allowed to speak to that because the president has claimed executive privilege. But the president has to claim executive privilege, which creates this problem. Right? We talked about the Fifth Amendment problem. If you say, I claim the Fifth, it makes you look guilty if you claim the Fifth, right? Because you're saying, I'm not going to incriminate myself. When you claim executive privilege, you're saying the president doesn't want me to discuss this issue. And so claiming executive privilege comes with some headaches. The president and the executive branch have a legislative aspect of their behavior. The legislative branch, right? The legislative branch makes the law. But we talked about the Nevada governor, right? The president has a State of the Union every year, and we should see one, right? We're always going to see one. We saw one this year, we're going to see one next year. The president's going to come out for the State of the Union and explain what issues need to be top priority, right? Now, we kind of know, regardless of who is elected, State of the Union next year is going to be about how do we recover from COVID, how do we set up jobs, how do we move forward, right? How do we set up a lot of these things? Right now, that's very clear that it's going to be very COVID focused. But moving forward, right, this is an opportunity for the president to set the agenda. Why? Because they can say, these are things I support. These are things I will move my resources to get through Congress in order to pass the laws that matter to me. And on the other end, these are things I do not want to see. And that informs the legislative branch on what laws they should pursue, right? If you know the president is against your bill, then it's the wrong time to submit your bill, right? Part of that is because the president has veto power, which we've discussed in the Congress Congressional Act as well. Whenever something is passed by Congress, the president can veto that aspect, and it takes a 2/3 vote in each house of Congress to override. Now, getting 2/3 of both houses to agree on something is very difficult. So a veto is very powerful today. It was less powerful 30 years ago because the parties didn't have so much differentiation, right? They weren't as partisan, right? Bipartisanship was a value that was held by Congress in the 70s to the 90s, right? That you wanted to reach across the aisle for better bills. But now, since they're not reached across the aisle, vetoes are more powerful. And then we talked about Congress. They pass a lot of stuff at the end of the legislative session. And so therefore, right, if it's in the last 10 days of the session, the president can enact a pocket veto. And that means they're not going to say there's a veto, they're just going to do nothing. And then if they don't sign that bill, it just goes out and then it becomes, right, it dies after the session, right? And so pocket vetoes are very common for presidencies. They just don't deal with certain issues. And sometimes, right, it's just that it's not, right, clear if it has electoral benefits or if it's something that they want. And they're not vetoing it and saying they definitely won't, but they're not also acting on it, right? So it's a little more indifferent than a veto, right? A veto is an absolute no. A pocket veto is sort of indifference, and I'm just not gonna deal with this. I'm not gonna respond to this at all, right? And because of the way the presidency works, that means it's gone and it has to be reintroduced, right? And it has to go through the whole process again, right? If it's a veto, right, they can vote against it. But a pocket veto, right, one of the things about a pocket veto is it dies, right? And then it has to be brought back into committee in the next session, right? It has to be brought back up the next year or the next legislative session. And that takes a long time to get back to the process, right? So a pocket veto can be a good delaying strategy when you don't want to be outright against something. All right. Right, because of this agenda setting power and because of all the resources of the president, right, the president has a legislative initiative, right? And this is just the power to bring a legislative agenda before Congress. And we talked about this, right? This is agenda setting. I can tell you what's important. I can set the order. I can also, right, start making resources available, right? The legislative, I can say, if you get this bill passed, I'm going to help you with other things, right? Or you really need disaster recovery in your state of Arkansas. If you start working on this bill, I'll start getting you some disaster resources, right? That you have a lot of office strength and you have a lot of resources at your disposal that you can control how the initiatives go, how legislative branch behaves, right? So the presidency, the executive branch, has a lot of influence over the other branches. An executive agreement is between states, between countries, right? An executive agreement is between the United States and France, or the United States and Germany, or the United States, right, and Saudi Arabia. An executive order is a behavior that's treated as legislation, but doesn't go through Congress, right? This is why DACA is sort of problematic, right? Under the Obama administration, you create this deferred action for children, right? That you come to the United States as a child and you turn 18 and you realize that you're not a citizen. And so we're not going to deport you when you go to apply for resources. And you can go to state universities with in-state costs because you're here and you've been here and there should be a process for you to become a citizen. But in the meantime, what DACA says is we're just not going to deport you. That's the whole thing, deferred action, right? We're just not going to deport you right now. And we're going to allow you to live in the United States and be treated as a citizen of whatever state you're in, right? That's why they can get in-state tuition until such time that they either become citizens or if they don't do something right, then they can be up for deportation, right? But the idea for that executive order, right, was that it couldn't pass Congress. Congress would not support it. And so then when President Trump comes in, one of the things that he does is he removes that executive order, right? Now, obviously I'm biased and very clearly I want everyone to go to school, so a different behavior. But the point here is that because it's an executive order, what was treated as law stops being treated as laws when you have a different presidency. But it was treated as law because right? ICE and other immigration services, they are run by the federal government, and therefore they're part of the executive branch, and the executive decides on how certain things are enforced. So DACA is an executive order that was very powerful, right? But it's only as long as that administration exists. The most obvious example of an executive order that really puts a lot of power into the presidency is in 1970 and into 1971, Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency, right? The EPA has become a very important agency, much more important than I think Nixon thought it would be, but it was established via executive order, which means the Department of Education and the Environmental Protection Agency, both established by the president, right, are both removable by presidents, right? The president could have completely disbanded the EPA, right? Now, one of the reasons why that's less and less likely to occur is because there are thousands of people who work for the EPA. There are thousands of people who work for the Department of Education. Now, whether or not you like those now, it's not something where you say, I'm going to shutter this, I'm going to close this down, and those people are just out, right? You can't, as a president, you can't lose that many jobs or close down that much aspects. But Republicans have often been against EPA and the Department of Education, which were not created legislatively, but the EPA specifically created by this executive order. But they haven't removed it, even though they have the power to, right? Remember, these are the powers, the express powers, right? But there are social limitations on those express powers, political limitations on what you could do, right? He has the power, the president has the power to remove the EPA, but is that politically viable in this period? Okay, so we've talked about express powers, right? Now let's talk about delegated inherent powers. So after the New Deal, right, we have the Great Depression, right? We have the stock market crashes, we have this Great Depression. The New Deal comes in, FDR comes in, and one of the things that happens is the federal government starts getting these really broad mandates. And one of the things about these mandates that come from the executive is that now it's not just about enforcing the law, it has become the job of the executive to make sure that people have a functioning economy and support from their government, right? This is right, the invention of the social welfare state. This is about having clear, right, ideas of how you're going to survive, right? Social security and, right, the operational safety and health agency, OSHA, right? This is about agencies that provide for your well-being. And when you have that, because it wasn't part of the US until the 1930s, there's no clear standards of how that works. And so what happens is FDR starts claiming inherent powers, right? FDR starts saying, this is part of my inherent powers. This is necessary for me to do my job. You want me to execute the laws? I need these other powers. And so inherent powers become a big part of the executive branch because it starts including things like people's welfare, finding them jobs, right? If you look at it now, right, one of the reasons that presidents stay in office is whether or not they create jobs during their first term, right? Is did you create jobs? And if you're not creating jobs, then it's hard for you to get reelected, right? So this becomes a new power, and therefore in order to get those things, to get people employed and to get them into safe practices and to help them have better health care, this becomes part of their job, and it starts to be argued that it's given to them, right? That it's part of their power through Article 1, Section 8, this necessary and proper clause, that I need these powers to do my job. Now, the other part is delegated powers, and the most obvious example is the War Powers Resolution, right? And we already talked about this. The president can send troops into any place, but it can't go to war unless it has congressional vote, right? Congress still decides if we go to war. But the United States has been in a lot of countries, troops on the ground, fighting and having military personnel die, right, without a war declaration. So the War Powers Act, the War Powers Resolution, gives a lot of power to the president to involve itself in other activities, right? Now, one of the most obvious examples of sort of going back that the public's not really paying that much attention to is during the Obama administration, right? Obama sent some special forces into Uganda to remove some aspects of a terrorist group, right? There was no congressional activity. There was no real public discussion, right? It was just a behavior, right? Drone strike starts occurring in the 21st century, right? There's no engagement, right? Even so much so that the Obama administration, that Obama himself says there's too much power over drones. The president has too much power over drones. He can send a drone anywhere whenever he wants, right? And because of the way the War Powers Resolution works, and because of the executive powers, there's no oversight, right? And that's Congress's job. Remember, we talked about in the last chapter, Congress is supposed to be doing oversight. The president is supposed to have energy. The executive is supposed to go out and get things done. So the War Powers Resolution makes it sort of difficult to make sure that what's behaving is following the rules, but also it allows quick response time. And that's one of the things is quick response is so important in the military now, right? That you need to have the president needs to have, the executive needs to have the ability to respond, but how do you make sure that they're not doing something inappropriate, right? How do you make sure you have oversight when you also need those quick responses? So delegated powers are very complicated. Inherent powers are just naturally going to occur as, right, the American people demand more of their government. So we talked about these roles right here. These are all the roles of the presidency. And so now let's talk about the presidency as an institution, right? Remember, the executive branch isn't just the secretaries and then the president. It's this whole behavior, right? It's this whole community. So hold on one second. Okay, so we start with the cabinet. And the cabinet is all the major departments and their secretaries, right? And I'm not gonna ask you to remember all this, right? Remember, we have Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, right? We've had all of these people go through a Secretary of Defense, right? We have Secretary of State, right? You have all of these offices, and those are the cabinet are just the people at top levels, at the top levels of government who interact directly with the president, right? The secretaries interact directly with the president. And so their job is to communicate with the president and get what the president wants, right? When you're talking about the executive branch, the president is the leader, right? It's not a diffuse system. In Congress, you have all of these different leaders, all of these voices. The executive branch is designed that one person is at the very top, and they distribute their preferences to their community, right? And so the big part of the cabinet's job is to get the president's preferences and then go to their individual agencies and their individual departments and then tell their departments how they want to make sure that the president's policies and preferences are met. Right? That's why everyone serves at the pleasure of the president, right? The president tells you what he wants, right? And then your job is to go to your agency and figure out how to do that, right? The president might say, I want to make sure there are no terrorists in Iraq. And you're like, oh, okay, that seems like a nightmare. Let me go to my agency and figure out what I can do to try and accomplish that goal, right? How do I figure that out, right? And if you're in the Secretary of the Army, right, then you go to the Army and you say, we need to start doing this behavior. How do I accomplish the president's goals? And then it's up to that agency and their deputies and all this other behavior to work that, right? So that's how we go from a cabinet to this National Security Council. The cabinet is exercising the policies and preferences of the president. The council's job includes the president, the vice president, secretary of defense, and these other officials that are invited by the president. And their job is not just to make sure the policies and preferences of the president are responded to, but also to effectively do these things, right? Why are some people in the room, even if they're not maybe politically aligned with the president, is because they have some sort of expertise or control over resources that is necessary, right? There's a video when Osama bin Laden is taken out, right, that there's so many people in that room, right? There's all these people in this room, they're all staring at a television, right? They're all watching this together. All of those people have some aspect of that operation that they're responsible for, that they're communicating with the president to. So National Security Council is like a cabinet, but it has a very specific goal. And then you have the White House staff. Now, the White House staff is all of these analysts and advisors and consultants, and they're all called special assistant or whatever role they have, right? And we see now, one of the things is that you can hire all of these people to work in the White House, and the expectation is that they're all providing some sort of analysis. But you might bring in people that you trust, right? In this presidency, more than others, right? In part because this president has adult children, and most presidents have not had adult children, right? Is that those children are involved in the presidency. They have a role in the presidency. They're analysts. They're working as counsel, and we know that some of them, right, do have some, right, some experience, but some of them are there due to trust, right? I trust that individual, right? And so remember that you want counsel, but you also want counsel that you trust. So we might see at times an individual who doesn't seem the most qualified in the position. That's because the president would rather have someone they trust than someone more qualified, right? Elizabeth Warren has an exceptional qualification when it comes to tracking down where money is going, right? She's sort of made a career. I know where money is going. Why is the money not going to the right place? Why is it not being spent? What's happening with money? She's very good at that. But if you're a Republican, you don't trust Elizabeth Warren, right? Your political agendas don't align, right? So she has a great deal of expertise, but she doesn't align with you, right? That not anything wrong with Warren, just she is a Democrat. If you're a conservative, your goals don't align, right? So you're not going to trust the information even if it's accurate from her, right? So you need trusted people, and that's why you have all of these special assistant roles because of that. And then you have this kitchen cabinet, and these are all the people together, right? You have the cabinet and all these formal roles, and then all these special assistants come together for the kitchen cabinet. All right. So when we're talking about the institution of the president, we've talked about all these secretaries, all of these special assistants. These are all people that the president wants around, right? These are all these people the president's want. There's also the executive office of the president. These are not people who are specifically appointed, right? Most of these people are sort of the bureaucracy of the executive branch, right? The executive office of the president has all this bureaucracy. And their job is very specific. Now, they still have to serve at the pleasure of the president, right? Any of them can be fired if they don't align with the presidency. But for the most part, their job is to provide certain aspects that aren't really as political, right? So there are three big ones. There's the Office of Management and Budget, the Council of Economic Advisors, and the National Security Council. And we talked about the National Security Council already. I want to make sure it's not in here later. Okay, so let's go back to this. So the Office of Management and Budget is very important to the president because it gives fairly accurate levels of spending and revenue based on policy, right? This is the same with the Council of Economic Advisors, right? Both of these groups have been there for a long time. They are specifically designed not to be political, but to be accurate. So this is the institution having its agencies that are designed to be full of bureaucrats. And bureaucrats are expected to do their job in a way that is rule-based. So one of the things about the OMB that we always ask, we say, how much will it cost and how much revenue will it bring in, right? So the OMB, during the Obama administration, talked about the cost of the Affordable Care Act, right, over 10 years, right? So the OMB would give a lot of credence to things to say how much it costs, how much it would bring in. When the president is talking about the economic systems or how growth was going, right, that's his Council of Economic Advisors, right? Council of Economic Advisors says this is what will work in order for you to grow the economy. Now, obviously, we have some different beliefs, right? Economists don't all agree. So you do have some politicalness, some partisanship in those offices, but what you see is these are differences of professional opinion, right? These are high-level experts that have these aspects, right? And when you have these two things, right, you want to be very clear that they are a permanent office, and so typically they don't really engage with the president as much. It's more that they provide documents for the presidency and the executive branch to use to justify whether or not a revenue bill will work or whether or not it's worth spending the money for the benefits they get, right? The Affordable Care Act costs the government money, right? So they always say how many people will insure at how much money, right? And it's up to these offices to do those jobs. And the OMB is a little more common. We didn't hear about it that much because everything's sort of out of whack with COVID, but usually OMB is very important as we come to an election because it's saying which plan will be better for the country, right? And which which plan will be better moving forward, right? So usually these offices say which of the two candidates have a better economic plan. All right. The presidency also has a succession line, right? That you have the vice president, right? The vice president, right, will take over in the case of resignation, incapacity, or death of the president, right? When we had a sort of a weird argument made by the right about, if Trump is gone or if he's impeached or something, then Nancy Pelosi takes over, right? But anyone who understands government would recognize that's not how it works. If Trump leaves, Mike Pence takes over, right? The line of succession is very clear, right? The vice president is the next to take over. So you have some weird conspiracy theories going around, right? And if you just basic knowledge of government, you know that they're not true, right? The vice president also serves some other purposes, right? They do cast a tie-breaking vote when necessary. It's happened a few times under this legislation. Tie-breaking votes are very rare. It's more common now because you have a more contentious Senate, but usually the Senate comes to some agreement so they can get to 51 votes, or someone abstains and it's 50 to 49, right? Usually getting a Democrat to abstain is easier than getting someone to vote in favor. So you have a lot of 50 to 49 votes. The 50 votes still wins because it's still more votes than voted against. And then what you will see, what you really saw in the last few presidencies is balancing the ticket. When Obama ran, he was very young, and so he needed more experience. And Biden has decades of experience in the Senate. And therefore, he balanced that ticket. He took this young energy, right, with someone who was more experienced. Trump puts Mike Pence on his ticket. Mike Pence is sort of calm and cool. He sort of has that moral high ground. And many people believe that he would lead a credence of morality and righteousness to President Trump, right? Sort of balance those things out. Kamala Harris provides youth, right? Because Biden, there is a concern that Biden is a little older, right? So Kamala Harris is younger, but she also represents minority interests, right? One of the things is that Biden has been in office a very long time, and he has been accused of inappropriate comments regarding race. And so by balancing the ticket with a minority, right, it takes away a lot of those issues. And so you want to make sure that when you're choosing a vice president, you're choosing someone that you say, well, even if they're not this, the other person has whatever missing quality they have, right? That's an electoral strategy. And we'll see how well they work, right? We should see how well they work moving forward. There's also the first spouse. The first spouse has typically just had ceremonial tasks, but starting in the 80s, under Reagan, and then especially under Barbara Bush, I always get them out of order. When Bush Sr. becomes president, his wife starts a reading program. And it becomes the culmination of this prospect where first ladies or the first spouse is expected to have some sort of task where they want to advocate a social issue that is not contentious, right? Now, for a long time, it was reading and literacy. You can't really say, oh, I want to improve literacy. Who's going to fight you on that? And then in 2009 or 2010, Michelle Obama, one of her big issues was getting healthier, right? Getting out and moving and getting fit. And she combined with a lot of other organizations about Get Fit or Play 60, right? All these organizations Get Fit. And it was one of the first times that you started to see some controversy in, right, whether or not that was a social issue should be tackled by the first lady, right? Now, we don't really know why, right? And then when we move into the current first lady, right, her big social issue is cyberbullying. And that became very contentious because people have argued that her husband is a cyberbully, and therefore, how can she have that as a social issue? Not that either of that is right or wrong, but that the social issue, advocating for social issues is no longer apolitical. It used to be a nonpartisan issue that was very easy to be supported by both sides. That's not really the case anymore. Okay. We talked about going public. One second. Let's go. Okay. We've talked about going public before when we talked about the media. Now, the president, more than anyone else, can mobilize the public, right? This is sort of the risk and the reward of being president, right? Everything that you say as president is up for extreme scrutiny, right? Everything that you say. Also, you have a captive audience, right? Americans, by and large, want to know what the president is doing most of the time. Now, sometimes when things are going good, the role is less so. But right now, right, we have a pandemic, and we have job loss and unemployment. We want to know what's happening every day. Every time the president does something, says something, we want to know, right? And so going public can be very useful, but as we talked about in the past, it can be very problematic. Now, this starts with FDR and his fireside chats. So remember that going public really becomes an effective strategy going into the 20th century because of the radio. And so FDR is one of the first to sort of have these long fireside chats. And he used to, because there wasn't a lot of competition, he used to go over all of these numbers and logistics about all these things. And so beginning with FDR, you have this informational aspect of the president, right? The president informs you about jobs and about the economy and about trade deficit. And so then after FDR, people believe that they're not only getting what the government is doing, but how the economy is doing for the president. And then it moves forward, right, to television and then eventually going online, right? And the benefit of going public online is that you can directly access whoever wants to hear your message whenever they want to hear, right? You don't have to deal with advertisers or censorship or any of those aspects, right? All of that can be easily accessible. And what we found is that now it is very important for candidates to seem connected to pop culture, right? One of the weird things is Reagan was because he was an actor, but after Reagan, you see a lot of distancing from pop culture, right? That both Bush Sr. and George W. Bush really not that connected to pop culture, right? Clinton a little more so, but not really as directly connected to pop culture. And then as you go into the 2000s, right, and then especially as you get the Obama administration, really connected to pop culture, right? Herman Cain, right, sang the intro to Pokemon, the Pokemon theme song, right, as part of his recognition that young voters were his support base, right? You have a lot more pop culture. You have Hillary Clinton doing the whip and the nay-nay to try to get voters to be encouraged with her. Pop culture becomes this huge thing. So now going online is necessary. You need to go to the places where your voters are. You need to be involved in their community, and that means you have to be aware of popular culture. That's a big shift for candidates. The only problem is that this puts a huge cost and risk because the public is really, really fickle. They might like you for something one day, and then that shifts dramatically, right? That changes dramatically, right? It used to be that a lot of people in office would say that they were colorblind. They don't see color, they don't see race, right? And you can't use that language today, right? So if you're an older and elected official and you say, oh, I don't even see race, people today would be very mad at that commentary, right? But in the 80s and 90s, that was the appropriate way to respond, right? And so you can have a very fickle public where the responses that used to be okay become less okay, right? That they shift very dramatically. Or you might make commentary where you're like, look, this is the way I see it. I think this is a progressive stance. And then you have the groups that really influence those aspects to change enough that they reject the way you're responding to it. So the public is very problematic and that you can get a lot of mobilization, but you can also do a lot of damage. Right? It's very fickle. It's very complicated and difficult to make sure that what you're saying will get the response that you want. Right? Typically, we don't know how that's going to work. Right? In fact, if you look at the last debates, there are these really great like tickers where we have people and they say yes or no whether they like something. They click when they like something during a speech, and a lot of analysts will say, I don't understand why everyone's clicking yes right there. Right? There might be something where everyone's like, oh, I really love that. Right? The fly that landed on Mike Pence's head got a lot of public support. Right? Why is that a case? Right? It's very hard to tell why people care about it. Maybe it's just interesting and new, and we want to discuss something that's not as contentious. Right? So the public is very fickle. The president has had growing power in part because of what is called an administrative strategy. In the early years, right, sort of as we're in the sort of 19th century, in the 1800s, the executive office of the president has 6 people, right, 6 assistants, right? So the office of Management and Budgets, the Council of Economic Advisors, right? The National Security Council, there's not a lot of people in it. From then until now, and this is actually dated, I think this is 3 years ago, that there were 2,500 individuals who worked in this office, right? And having 2,500 people who help you understand what policies work, how to budget, right? How the budget's going to be impacted by new policy. It gives the presidency and the executive branch a lot of power to recognize what is going to work and what's not going to work before Congress and before the constituents have a chance to. The other part is that this idea of regulatory review. So when we talk about bureaucracy, one of the things is that whenever you have a new law, the laws don't actually make it clear what you should do, right? Laws are very often vague, right? The law will say you need to prosecute anyone in possession of this amount of drugs. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean I arrest them all? Does it mean I give them a ticket, right? But this is when something is criminal. Does it mean it's a ticketable offense? Is it an arrestable offense? Is it a federal law? Do I put them in prison? Do I put them in jail? Right? Do I treat it as a felony? Right? What are the laws about search and seizure? How does this apply to constitutionality and the rights of the Bill of Rights? Right? A lot of this is unclear. So the executive branch works through the bureaucracy to implement new laws. And implementation has a lot of variants, right? How you implement the law can be very, very, very effective in controlling the system itself. And so you have all of these people, you have these 2,500 people, and they help with all these bureaucracies. And then inside these other bureaucracies are agencies like the FBI, like the CIA, but also the Postal Service, right? We saw that at some point, someone told, right, someone at the Postal Service to dismantle some sorting machines. And it caused this entire aspect of our mailing to slow down and have some problems. Now, one of the things about that, right, is that that's an executive branch. The U.S. Postal Service is an agency, right? It has to pay for itself, but it responds to the federal government. And so if you have them saying, we need some new way to look out for mail fraud, and one of them saying is that, well, sorting machines don't pick up on that, then implementation might be taking down those machines, right? That's an actual law, an implied rule, an implied power that exists because of this. And the administrative strategy allows them to use that to influence the behavior, right? Whenever you have a new law, it's very vague. When you're implementing it, you have a lot of control of how it's implemented, and implementation can change the way it was perceived dramatically, right? Many of the laws, the way that they're pushed through, don't really fit with the actual law that was passed, right? Implementation is very different from the law itself. We already talked about executive orders and memoranda, right? You had a lot of executive orders that impact people's lives, right? The most obvious one in recent history is DACA, right? If you are an immigrant from another country and you were raised here as a child, right, DACA impacts you very directly, right? And it really matters one way or the other. A memoranda is, an executive order is, I'm going to treat this as law. A memoranda, when you write a memo to an agency, you tell that agency how you want implementation to occur, right? So an executive order is like, this is how the law is going to be, right? A memo is, here's how I want you to implement that behavior, right? Implementation, right? One of the things that we see in a memo is maybe ICE or Immigration Services, right? About separating children from their families, right? However you feel about it, I don't care, right? The point is that is a memo where they're saying, we are trying as an agency to limit, right, immigration, undocumented or illegal, whatever language you want to use, into the United States. And so as a deterrent, we're going to separate children from their family, right? That's a memo to say, this is how we want you to better function as an immigration service, right, or as a border patrol service, to sort of to disincentive, right, to give less incentives for people to come over, they risk being separated from their children, right? And because of that, right, then maybe they won't over as much, and then we won't have as much of an immigration problem if you believe there's an immigration problem. That memo really informs that behavior of that agency. The next part is when you actually get a bill to your desk and you're signing into law. One of the things that started a lot with George W. Bush was this idea of signing statements. And signing statements is where you sign a law in and then you explain what that law means to you. And George W. Bush did this a lot. He said, I am going to sign this law, right? I know that it's going to get, even if I veto it, it's going to get a veto override. So I'm going to sign the law, but then I'm going to explain what that means and how I should be enforcing that law. And in the signing statement, it modifies the behavior of the law just enough that it fits with more with the policies and preferences of the executive branch, of the president. right? So signing statements are very powerful. They say, here's how I expect the law to be implemented. And a signing statement speaks to all these agencies that might be impacted by a new law and how they're going to behave. The very last part of this administrative strategy is when the president chooses not to enforce a law. Now, here's the problem. Article 2, Section 3 says the president has to enforce all of the laws, faithfully execute all laws. All laws are faithfully executed, right? That's in the Constitution. However, there's no mechanism if the president does not enforce certain laws. And the president can argue that certain laws don't fit with the behavior of other laws, and therefore they don't match, right? If you say this doesn't work with our economy, with our security, with our national defense, our national interest, then I'm going to serve the national interest, and therefore I'm not going to enforce this law. And so there is a legal avenue for non-enforcement of the law by presidents, and it's not really challenged that much by Congress, right? Because Congress has been given more and more power to the presidency. They don't really have the ability to challenge when the president chooses not to enforce a law. That means that Congress could go through the whole thing of writing a bill, go through that whole thing we talked about, markup, get out of committee, go through this whole process to become a law. The president signs it and then says, you know what, I'm not going to enforce this law, right? It's very problematic. It's quite rare, but it is an aspect of the presidency that occurs. And so we're a little ahead, but that's good. So let's review, right? The presidency is created by Article 2 of the Constitution. So because it's created by Article 2 of the Constitution is very clear about certain things. One of them is expressed powers. The president is in charge of the military. President is in charge of the military, right? Absolutely. Military and intelligence agencies, civilian command, right? And civilian command is very important. Also, the executive enforces the law, right? Implements and enforces the law, right? That is very powerful because the way you implement the law, the way you enforce the law has a lot of variance and discretion. Right? There's a lot of discretion. When we talk about bureaucracies, we'll talk about this principal agent problem, right? That who writes the law is different from who actually goes out and enforces the law. And so you have a discrepancy between those two. Not only does the president have express powers, but they have implied powers, right? FDR made this very clear that in order to serve the nation, there has to be a lot of other roles that the state fulfills, right? Social Security is created under FDR, right? But also we have Medicare and Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, right? And all of these cases where the government is stepping in to say, I need to help you with your livelihood, right? Whether it's unemployment insurance or it's some sort of right benefit based on your job or whatever it is, right? The government is stepping in more and more, starting with the New Deal up until today, right? Those are implied powers. So you have these express powers. FDR said saying, well, I need all this other power to do the job that I need to do to make sure the country's running well, to keep the economy going right. Is the president's responsibility to keep a highly functioning economy, right? Even though that individual doesn't have as much power over the economy, it is still their responsibility, right? It's their responsibility even if they don't have the authority. And then the last is delegated powers. And Congress over the years has given more and more power to the presidency, which has created an imbalance where the president and the executive branch has more power than Congress. And Congress could take that power back, but by delegating that power to the president, it takes away that electoral cost, right? They're not held accountable for these more difficult issues, right? The president, through the War Powers Resolution, can send troops places, but also because they have the ability to send troops in certain places, they also have to pay the political cost. Whenever there's a war, whenever there's a deployment, whenever troops go overseas, the president pays that cost. And that's delegated power from Congress to the executive branch so that those electoral costs are shifted to the presidency. Why does the president have so much power on these things, right? One is this, right, that they can set the agenda, right? We're going to hear State of the Union next year, right? It's going to be very clear about that. Setting the agenda is very powerful. The president says the things that he wants to consider and the things he doesn't, and he puts them in order, right? The order in which their importance is listed by the president and the State of the Union address, and then the executive office of the president. The president has so many people working for them, right? So many analysts and so many people with professional expertise that it gives the presidency and the cabinet a lot of power just by having access to that information, right? If you need an answer to a question, the The president has the most ability to get an answer that is based in the merit and the facts, right? Now, there might be some political bias in both sides, right? But, right, the clear answer is that the executive office president can do that, right? Why is it that the president's budget is adopted? We talked about this with the governor, in Nevada, the governor and the presidency, because they have the staffing, right, to actually write a budget. Congressional individual people in Congress don't have the staff to write a full budget. So the president and the governor, they write budgets and then they submit them. And there's a lot of acceptance of their budget because who else is going to go step by step, right? Who else is going to go step by step and set every budget and everything, right? Only the executive branch, because they have the executive office of the presidency. We talked about going public, right? Going public is risky, but you get directly to your audience. You can speak directly to your voters, directly to your constituency. We talked about the administrative strategy, right? Where you can take laws, implement them in the way that you want to implement them. Make sure that you have enough control that even when Congress passes a law, if you don't exactly like it, you can use signing statements or you can use the implementation process to make it fit better with your preferences. And then the last thing, there are limits on the president, right? In case it's not as clear, right? The president has a lot of power, but there are very clear limits. The first limit, which the president will always run into, is economic, right? Why is it that, right, the behavior of the president and the challenger is so different, right? One of the reasons why Biden's behavior and Trump's behavior are so different is because Trump is definitely going to pay an electoral cost for the economy having a downturn, right? His costs for an economic downturn are more if there were more deaths, right? Even if there were more deaths from the pandemic, it would be less politically costly than the economic downturn we're seeing right now, right? That's why the president wants to run it. And it's in partly because he's a Republican, but also because of the incumbent, right? The incumbent always wants a good functioning economy, much so more than the challenger. The challenger might be looking at other issues. That's why we have a different behavior in those two. Beyond their political parties, they also have different electoral goals, right? And Biden doesn't need the economy to be working well right now. He needs it to be working well next year if he's elected, right? That's the differences in behavior. And then when you have an opposition in Congress, right? We saw from 2016 to 2018, a Republican Congress work with a Republican president to get a lot of stuff done, right? The skinny bill is sort of the last of those things, right? But then in 2018, the Democrats take over the House, and a lot of these challenges to the Affordable Care Act, a lot of these challenges in Congress, they end because the House controls revenue bills, and they put a stop to the behavior of Trump and the Republican Party from 2018 to 2020, right? So it's just opposition like Congress can put a real check on the presidency as long as one house, and we call that divided government. We talked about earlier what it means to be a divided government. Okay, so let me go to Web Campus really quick. And one, you should see that the paper prompt is up. Okay, the paper submission is up. So in case you need to submit it now, I see someone already submitted it, so that's good. Is computer gonna crash? Okay. The other part is that I want to look at the schedule just to be very clear. Today is the last day to register to vote online. If you have not registered, please do so. Make sure you get out of here and get that done, right? We talked about 12 and 13. We have one more lecture. It's going to be the Sage for a State, right? It's going to be a Nevada lecture. I'm going to do a little bit of review. On the 3rd, you should see a review quiz. It's not worth any points. You don't have to do it. But I want to give you 10 questions that you can sort of look at and be prepared of what you should expect from the exam, right? You don't have to do it, but it's a good review. And so you can do it unlimited times, and it's going to tell you the correct answer, and it's going to be worth like 0.001 points, but just ignore that, right? It's basically not an impact on your grade. If you want to test it out, go ahead. If you don't feel comfortable, that's fine. On the 5th, we're having the exam, right? So here's the thing is, today is the last day to register online. On Tuesday is election day. It's going to be crazy, right? Make sure that you go out and vote. Get that extra credit. It is worthwhile to get that extra credit. Right after that, we have an exam, and then a week after that, we have a paper due. So you have a lot of deadlines coming up. Do not forget those deadlines. You're going to see them popping up on Web Campus, right? Make sure you get these 2 weeks. On the 12th, you can be very clear what your grade is, and some of you can be done for the semester. And I want that opportunity to give to some of you, right? Even though I have very few people in the classroom and very few people online, I want to give you the opportunity because I'm going to start reaching out to people with worse grades and I'm going to start contacting you. I'm going to give you a plan of what you need to do if you want to pass my class. So if you're not doing as well, I'm going to give you a plan. If you get to that point and you're like, I have a B and I really want an A, then we'll have a discussion about how that is possible, right? But each and every one of you has a chance to decide where you want to be at after the 12th. You have to turn in the paper, you have to do the exam. And I know I've said this a lot, but I've never failed a student who turned in a paper. Not that that's a rule, but I've never had to. Every student who's turned in a paper has ended up passing my class with at least a C, right? So make sure you turn in the paper. I cannot express that enough. Someone's not going to turn it in, and it's going to take them from a B to an F, right? It's a very, very dramatic change in behavior. So just be aware of that. I know I have sort of a captive audience because of the people in the classroom, but for those of you online, right, make sure you're doing that work. And for those of you in the classroom, I appreciate you being here, right? Be safe, be careful, right? We're going through an election week, but also things should calm down dramatically after next Tuesday. Get through the next 2 weeks, and then you can transition your focus to other places. All right, thank you. Have a good day.